There's a pattern in history that defines how people steal billions and get away with it for years. A Ponzi scheme here, accounting fraud there, a blood-testing lie somewhere else. Some of the biggest heists weren't armed robberies. They were boardrooms and websites, promises of returns that didn't exist, and accounting tricks so elaborate they fooled auditors for years. The common thread? Someone convinced millions to trust them with their money, then weaponized that trust into theft on a scale that destroys lives. This is the story of 7 of the biggest scams in history. How they worked, who fell for them, and why these patterns keep repeating. Once you see the mechanism, you'll understand why new versions are being executed right now. Let's start with the biggest Ponzi scheme ever, Bernie Madoff. In 2008, the global economy collapsed and people tried to withdraw from their investments. That's when Madoff's operation imploded. For 20 years, he'd convinced pension funds, charities, and wealthy individuals to trust him with their savings. He promised steady 11% annual returns with almost no volatility. It was too good to be true, and it was. Madoff just took money from new investors to pay old investors their returns. Billions went into his personal bank account. Fake trading statements showed profits that never existed. By the time the truth came out, his scheme had hit $65 billion. The SEC had investigated him multiple times, even warned in 1992, but found nothing because Madoff had the perfect cover. A legitimate brokerage business that actually made money provided credibility that kept the lie alive for decades. When it collapsed, thousands lost their entire life savings. Madoff died in prison in 2021. Alan Stanford operated Stanford International Bank in Antigua, promising 12% annual returns. $7 billion flowed in. Like Madoff, it was fabricated. New client money paid old client returns. When the 2008 crisis hit and redemptions spiked, Stanford claimed to have personally invested $741 million to support the bank. His accountants inflated a property from $63 million to $3 billion on paper, a 5,000% increase on unchanged land. It worked for years because nobody looked closely. Stanford paid bribes to regulators and auditors to stay quiet. When authorities shut it down in 2009, $7 billion was gone. Stanford is serving 110 years in prison. Enron was different. This wasn't a Ponzi scheme. This was accounting fraud embedded into a Fortune 500 company. Enron was an energy company founded in 1985, and by 2000 it was the most innovative company in America. Fortune magazine said so. The stock was $90 per share. Market cap exceeded $60 billion. But behind the scenes, Enron was using accounting loopholes that wouldn't make sense to normal people. Mark-to-market accounting allowed them to count future profits as current profits. Special purpose entities hid billions in debt from failed projects. They overvalued international assets to generate cash. They manipulated quarterly reports. Every quarter was a lie, but each lie was believable because the previous lie had been believed. The company imploded when the deception became visible. Stock price crashed from $90 to under $1. $63 billion in assets evaporated. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in history at that time. 4,000 employees lost their jobs. Around 2/3 of employees' pensions invested in company stock became worthless. Stock they'd bought at $83 at the start of the year. 22 people were convicted, including the CEO and CFO. Arthur Andersen, the auditing firm that enabled Enron, was destroyed. Its auditors had signed off on the lies, and once that truth came out, the firm couldn't recover. It closed. Elizabeth Holmes represented a new kind of scam, the tech fraud. Theranos was supposed to revolutionize blood testing. Small devices that required just a finger prick instead of traditional needles. Results in minutes instead of days. Holmes promised it all. In 2015, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Holmes was worth $4.5 billion. The problem? The technology didn't work. It had never worked. For years, Holmes faked lab tests, misled investors, sent false results to patients. Whistleblowers eventually exposed it. Patients who'd made healthcare decisions based on false Theranos results discovered they'd been given wrong information. One woman thought she'd had a miscarriage based on a Theranos test, but she actually carried the baby to term. Another man received false prostate cancer warnings. The illusion held because Holmes had created a culture of secrecy and intimidation. When authorities shut it down, Theranos collapsed in 2015. Holmes was sentenced to over 11 years in prison in 2022. WorldCom and Wachovia round out the list. WorldCom, a telecommunications giant, hid $11 billion in accounting fraud. Assets inflated, costs hidden. In 2002, it filed the largest bankruptcy in American history at that time. Wachovia was implicated in what became the largest money laundering case ever, moving roughly $380 billion for Mexican drug cartels without proper scrutiny. These weren't criminal masterminds. They were employees and executives who just kept going, kept hiding, kept lying until the math stopped working. Here's what connects all seven: trust. Every scam requires trust. Without it, the scheme falls apart immediately. Madoff and Stanford had track records that built trust. Enron had size and media praise. Holmes had Silicon Valley mythology and venture capital backing. Theranos had partnerships with Walgreens and the military, or claims of them. And in each case, when the time came to verify, to look closely, to ask hard questions, people didn't. Regulators didn't. Auditors didn't. Because the perpetrators had established enough credibility that scrutiny seemed unnecessary. That's the real theft. Not just the money, the theft of trust itself. Once that's broken, it takes decades to rebuild. If this opened your eyes to how these frauds operate, to the mechanisms that enable them, subscribe. Because understanding the patterns of historical fraud is the only real defense against the new frauds being designed right now with even more sophistication.